Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And with me today is someone who's been on my show before, not this show, a different show. And he's a friend of Juan's. They do a podcast together. His name is Dr. Narco Longo, and he has the Old World Florida YouTube channel, as well as the Coquina Cowboy show that I just alluded to that he does with Juan, making his maiden appearance here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Dr. Narco, how are you, brother? You laugh when I said your name. Is that an alias? Would you prefer to be called something else?
No, it's an alias, but
that's what you're going by.
Yeah.
Okay, not Nick or John or Rick or so. I don't know Dr. Narco's real name. Maybe I just guessed correctly. Who knows? But I'm not going to attempt anything further. I got to say, brother, when Juan introduced your stuff to me, I was very compelled. I was a little jealous. I'm like, oh, here we go. Juan's getting in all this stuff with some guy without me. And I'm excited that we're doing this together because you're touching on a lot of topics that connect in one way or another to things that I've been researching over the past few years. And I especially appreciate having you on the show after having the first two conversations with you. The first one was a little off kilter for what we usually do, but the second one, I feel like, we discussed the old world subject from an angle that I appreciate, because I think there is a lot of, propaganda is a loaded term. I think there's a lot of very amateurish research that's being presented in a very professional looking way, and that is not at all what you have on your YouTube channel. Your YouTube channel has very detailed research and is presented in a fun way that looks professional. So I want to hand that to you and say that, among this topic, there's a lot of hucksters and hoaxsters, and you guys, your research over there is top notch, in my opinion. Take that for what it's worth. But particularly when it connects to, this idea that there were other cultures here that were advanced in North America way before Columbus that, for the most part, have been forgotten or erased from our normal history for a number of reasons. One of the big indications for me up here in New England was the stone walls and how many of them look like they have really, really old lichen. And I looked this up, lichen grows an inch every 100 years or something, right? So if you have like a 6-inch across piece of lichen on a rock, well, that might have been there for, 600 years, right? That's a rough estimate. I might be wrong on that exactly. But I started noticing the texture and the patina on some of these older rock walls, and I started thinking, maybe there's something deeper here, right? And with Tartaria being like this huge topic at the time, I was like, oh, maybe it has to do with that. And I was, sort of surprised to find so much history here in New England, where I'm from, that I just was not aware of. And I feel like you had a similar experience digging through your state's history, being in Florida, and where we kind of have the similarity, at least to me, is you noticed these stone anchors, or you at least noticed, these strange anomalies, and I noticed these stone walls. So maybe I'm wrong there, but what exactly kicked off this interest in digging into the alternative or forgotten history of where you're from?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've kind of always been into these alternative subjects like conspiracy theories, the truth, the occult, stuff like that. But Tartaria came around, and I was like late to the Tartaria party, I guess you could say. And I just realized no one was talking about Florida, and I knew there had to be some stuff there. And pretty much the first Wikipedia page I pulled up about like Henry Flagler or something, it's all right there for you to see. You have a textbook reset. People like to say that word, but they can't often point to clear examples. Well, in Florida, you have about 3 or 4 different changing of hands where a whole landmass changed hands, right? From someone to the Spanish. Parts of it went to the French up north near like South Carolina, that area, because that was all like Florida territory at one time. And then it went to the English for a period, back to the Spanish, then to the American. So, within those, you have all these opportunities for rewrites of history.
Right.
And that's even easier to swallow once you hear that pretty much the entire indigenous population was taken out, genocided. So it's right there to see. So that's kind of what got me into it, is first looking at some of the architecture, the Moorish architecture. The southeast United States has some of the most Moorish looking buildings in the world, outside of the Middle East, of course. And we're told that was all just post-Civil War, what white people building it for no reason, essentially. When I believe there's much more to that story.
Right.
Especially once you understand when Columbus left, when he did, whether you believe he was real or not, that's okay. But when he supposedly left, lines up precisely with the expulsion of the Moors from from Spain in general, in the War of Granada. And they would have either escaped to the Americas or have already been established in the Americas, because the Moors themselves are the descendants of the Phoenicians, in part, Berbers, but Phoenician descendants as well, because that whole area, Barbary, as they call it, Barbary, that's where we get Berber. That was all Phoenician colonies back in the old ancient times, and they were at war with Greek and the Greece and Rome, so they got written out of history. And fast forward about 1,000 years, you have the Moors getting written out of history, largely European history. And that carries over into Florida as well, into the New World, the quote unquote New World. But as we're all finding out, it seems to be a bit older than the old world, you know?
Right. And I remember you mentioning the last time we spoke how Phoenician and Finnish are really the same word and culture if you just take away the difference in spelling. And I tend to agree from what I've seen. Our idea of countries and cultures have been skewed, whereas in the past it was way more fluid. Different cultures were, trading across sea routes. They weren't constricted to one site, and maybe they had one place of origin, but they spread out really far. And when you talked about just now Columbus being this sort of, pivotal point in history. I don't know if you said that exactly, but that's how I see it, as a sort of pivotal point in history where these cultures that were possibly here in the New World were defeated by the Spanish or left, which maybe explains why the Spanish went and took over a lot of that territory. So where do you want to go from here? Do you want to maybe give the oldest examples and work our way back, or should we start with some more recent stuff and work our way? How should we approach this? Because there's a lot of information here, and some of these stone anchors that you show in your many videos, they go back, if I'm correct, almost like 3,000. 5,000 years or more.
More than that, yeah.
More than that. And then there were
probably 7,000 plus.
Wow.
Most of them.
And there was the bog in, excuse me, I'm looking down at my notes, Windover Farm, where they found people 6,000 years old and had European DNA, no traces of any what we would consider, indigenous North American DNA. And this is in Florida. So clearly there are some pretty old examples of evidence for things that don't match the timeline as we're told. So where do you want to start? What do you think is the best evidence for people to wrap their head around this?
Well, I think a great starting point is the Phoenician-Finnish connection. Like you said, these cultures might not have been so divided by skin color necessarily, at least when it comes to occupation. So my friend Ben from Analog, Waking Up with Analog, he let me in on, basically the opinion that the Phoenicians were not necessarily a single group of people. It was a guild of mariners. It was an occult order that used maritime activity as its allegorical process, much in the same way like alchemy uses chemistry, right, to reflect higher principles and symbols. This would be what the Phoenician order would be, the Phoenician order, right? So that's why you would have some maybe dark-skinned, light-skinned Phoenicians. People want to say, were they white? Were they black? It's not that simple, especially when it comes to the Phoenicians, and especially when you realize Phoenician was a phonetic system, not a language. And actually, almost every Western modern language using the Latin alphabet is pretty much, or the Roman alphabet, whatever we call it, is a phonetic language. Hello, we're closed. Sorry, 1 second. Hello, sorry, we're closed.
Wait, we're closed.
All good. People came into the bookstore, but
no worries. I paused.
Okay.
I paused the recording. We're back. So, a phonetic language meaning that there's a certain amount of common syllables shared, but it's not like a set language, meaning like it has to mean the same thing every time, right? It's more that there's a certain shared group of symbols. I mean, maybe I don't understand phonetics, but maybe give me the 101.
Phonetic language is basically where one letter equals one sound, approximately. So you can teach this to pretty much anybody, especially if you're a navigator, a mariner, a seaman that is going far across the ocean and landing in perhaps unpredictable places. They would do their best, but if you're going from Finland to Florida, you might not land precisely where you want to. So they would encounter different people, these northern Viking people, the Finnish, right? And the Finnish language, the original Finnish, not modern Finnish, is one of the oldest languages in the world. And that's because it's a predecessor to Phoenician. It is runic. Okay, the Vikings, the northern Germanic peoples, used runic language. Well, when you look at Carthage, when you look at North Africa, when it was a Phoenician colony, what was their language called? Punic. So Phoenician is like the oldest phonetic language, written language, alphabet, the oldest alphabet, I should say. And that's because they could teach it to anyone they met. A is A, B, B, and they can teach this symbol by symbol to anybody. And you can begin to articulate, and it makes the process of trading with people you've never met so much easier. Now, the Finnish people are known to be craftsmen, finesse. This is where the word finesse comes from. They have finesse when they make things because they have this ancient tradition of exporting goods from Northern Europe to all these foreign places. Now, for example, when you come to Florida, there's all these artifacts that don't belong in Florida. Some of them are on the Marco Island artifacts. Some of them are the bog bodies for sure. They themselves are essentially Vikings, Danish-looking people. I have slides that show how the bog bodies match exactly ones in Finland. Now that's significant to Florida as well because Florida, Lake Worth, Florida, the city I'm in right now, has the highest concentration of Finnish people outside of Finland, definitely in America. So that's because the Gulf Stream leaves Florida, the Gulf of Mexico, and goes to the Gulf of Finland, Gulf Stream, Gulf to Gulf.
Right.
So these Vikings, ancient Vikings, who are the Phoenicians, same people, would take the Gulf Stream from Finland to the Gulf of Mexico, where the warm water oozes out of the ground in the Gulf of Mexico. Much in the same way that Florida has the highest concentration of freshwater springs in the world.
Right.
So there's your fountain of youth. That is the fountain of youth. That's why the Spanish were here for about 300 years. And we're pretty much going all over the place. But I can flip through some slides if you want to see some stuff that I'm talking about.
Yeah, please do. I just to maybe help people wrap their heads around it, I think all of this relates. I mean, we jump from the Phoenicians to the Finnish there, and the Greeks understood the Phoenicians as, particularly connected to Atlantis, right? I think Plato talked about, having some sort of discussion with a guy who was Phoenician or Egyptian, and they were saying, your Greek culture is like a child compared to our very old, tradition, right? And your understanding is equally childish. He was saying to Plato, who was just then learning about Atlantis and all this stuff. And I don't think I mentioned this, but that's what we're talking about here. Florida as Atlantis. And I think you have a great deal of evidence to posit that maybe Florida was the exact site where Atlantis was. And you mentioned this in our past conversation, how the Fertile Crescent isn't quite the crescent that you might imagine, and the Gulf of Mexico seems to fit that description, and I would agree. So here we are looking at Johann von Sachs, right? Tell us about this gentleman.
Yeah. So Johann Christian von Sachs, he is a resident of Tarpon Springs, Florida, and basically decades ago he noticed these ancient stone anchors that were scattered all across people's lawns, in front of neighborhoods, in and around the Tampa Bay area, mostly in Pinellas and Pasco County. He could bring you about 2,000 of them, big ones, notable ones. Now you can find them all over Florida, scattered, but in this area they're so concentrated that it's pretty remarkable. So that's Johann Christian von Sachs. He has royal blood, which he believes assisted him in the process of psychically, intuitively being guided to these stones because of the implications that they have. And I should say, before he found this, he was already an Egyptologist, a pyramidologist, and a psychic archaeologist, basically. And here's an example. You have a stone with a hole bored through it. And in the top left corner, if you can see my mouse, there's a worn down edge where a rope has been, clasped through the top of that hole, basically.
Right.
And has been being tugged on for hundreds, thousands of years.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and sorry to cut you off. Maybe you're getting to this, but to the maybe unexamined person who hasn't seen the stuff like this before, they might say, well, how did you get it there? Obviously, they drilled a hole in it to pick it up, right? But you can tell if you really examine it that the boring hole, the inside of it, has the same weathering as the exterior of the rock, as you mentioned in your documentary. And this type of stone is so hard that it would probably take maybe decades or centuries of a rope grinding against it to create that kind of groove there.
I'll show you a good example of a groove. Here's one of the largest ones. Right. And in the bottom right corner, basically it's cut off, but you can see where the rope again was hooked into the side. Now, eroded over time.
Now, you mentioned in the documentary that's on your channel, and the link is in the description for folks who want to go and check that out. You mentioned that the locals call this the Silver Spur, and maybe you need to be there in person to notice. I'm curious, does it have a sort of silvery shimmer? Is it glimmer? Like, are there any qualities to the rock that might, like what? No. Okay. What is this made out of?
They're all limestone.
Okay. Wow.
They're all like coquina bedrock.
Wow.
Limestone, clumped up shell.
Right.
But so this is basically in rocks. This is on the softer side. You could chisel this easily, but it does weigh a shit ton. And to answer your question, it's not silver, but it is spur shaped for sure. It's almost like an arrowhead. It's pointy. It's jagged.
Right.
And it's covered in like moss, or I don't know if you'd call it lichen or whatever you were saying. I don't know how to pronounce that, but either that's a very, very dark and old patina, or that's a heavy layer of moss or something like that.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, I think limestone might have a particular, effect in certain environments, right? And then who knows, maybe based on where it is, what type of biome it is, that would determine what type of lichen or moss would grow on any given rock. But yeah, the ones I was mentioning earlier, like the lichen circles that you see on some of the stones around here, I'm almost certain that that's like a temperate forest type of like plant. It doesn't grow somewhere as warm and humid as Florida. But yeah, this is really tremendous that they've moved all of these to sort of be featured in front of houses and in this apartment complex here. So the story is that they were sold by a member who maybe was, or by a guy who was a member of the Smithsonian Institute. They were sold to people to be lawn ornaments. Is that what the official story is as to how they ended up all over people's yards and whatnot?
It's not directly connected to the Smithsonian. It was just a case of they were scattered across the landscape and they decided to incorporate them into the landscaping. So I'll show you how this one in the center there, that patina has actually been power washed off. Because when they were putting these in neighborhoods, for some reason, they decided to bleach them. Now, this one, another very large one, this one's over 10,000 pounds, possibly 15,000. This one's at least 8,000, maybe 10,000 pounds. This is what John has told me.
Right, and before, for the listening audience, we were looking at giant coquina stones with just one borehole. This one that John's standing next to in the picture has 2 boreholes in it, and it's probably the size of a Volkswagen. I mean, this is a huge stone right in the center of a parking area or a street.
As big as an SUV.
Wow.
And basically that one I would call boring. But something about limestone, limestone does occasionally make holes of water erosion. I think the people that were making these either would have taken advantage of those and smoothed them out. But on these ones, the edges are so sharp that this had to have been bored. And when you see how many rope marks there are that have been, have worn down the rock in certain areas. This one also, what you're seeing, this has been power washed to remove the dark coating because they wanted it to be bright. I don't know. They put it in front of this neighborhood. It's not a very nice neighborhood.
Could it be that there was some sort of markings on them? I mean, one that you guys show right at the beginning of your documentary have clear carvings of faces in them. This one here. Is it possible that they were, I mean, you said that this is a fairly soft stone. If they're power washing it, maybe they could have smoothed down some carvings that were in there.
It's possible. You can see on this one, it looked like they tried power washing it in certain areas. It probably just took too much time and they just gave up. But that sand dollar looking one, I call this one the sand dollar. That's my nickname for it. If you see it from the side, it's very thin from a sand dollar, basically. And those 2 holes are pretty much perfectly parallel. Now, people say, well, that could be natural. And I say no. But if you want an example of something that could not be natural, here's what you're looking for. This is basically a perfectly bored hole. This is boring. This is not erosion of any type. This is tooling, advanced tooling going through the rock, perfectly round hole. That's like a little root or a little clump of dirt sticking out right there.
Would you say it's like a 6-inch in diameter for people listening? Like there's a hand there for reference, but we don't know how big the hand is. Would you say it's like a 6-inch diameter?
Probably less.
Less, okay.
This is one of the smallest holes we ever saw, and it's the most advanced tool marks, it looks like.
Right.
I'd say this is maybe 3 inches.
Wow.
About as long as a finger across.
Yeah, certainly doesn't seem like accident. And, we've seen a couple of these limestone naturally occurring potholes at certain waterfalls. And I think I brought this up in one of our previous conversations, that a past guest explained to me that happens during lightning storms, where the rock has a high concentration of iron in it, and the lightning is attracted to it, and it, in this, intense reaction, shoots a ball of stone out of the rock. And I don't know how true that is. Past guest Topher claims to have seen that himself in Costa Rica, and I've seen the holes at several different sites. So these rocks do occur. Like, it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that they found these pieces of coquina limestone looking like that on their own, and then picking them up and putting them in place to be used in as an anchor. That's a whole nother story. I mean, do you think that what's the theory on how they got scattered across the land? Was it a giant storm? Was it, like that maybe the water level was higher or lower at certain periods in time? How did they get kind of loosely scattered?
Well, those bog bodies that we were talking about earlier, is my audio good?
Yeah, you sound fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. I was going through my the good mic. But the bog bodies, you can date those for sure to at least 7,000 years ago, because they're out in the ocean, or one of them is. That's the Manitoba or Minnesota.
Right. There was the underwater burial ground that they found off the Minnesota Key. Yeah, I did see that.
And that is the same style and age as the Windover Bog. The Windover Bog was inland, kind of, I think, near Orlando. I could be wrong. But Minnesota Key was over near Venice, Florida, on the west coast of Florida. So that's on the west coast and the east coast, same culture, this European DNA, European features, and textile, like weaving technology that was thousands of years advanced for their time. So that's why they don't like talking about these. They also had strawberry blonde hair.
Yeah, that's another strange thing. I mean, I haven't seen that description, but in some of the Spanish explorers' descriptions, they have, red-haired giants. They have, very tall, supposedly Native Americans with very pale skin. But yeah, that's strange for sure. You just mentioned the detailed textiles and weaving. I saw a picture last night of King Philip, and for people who aren't aware, King Philip was not a European. He was a Native American named Metacomet, who the British basically, I think they mocked him a little bit, or I don't know, maybe they were being respectful by calling him King Philip. But in one of the images that Paul Revere drew of King Philip, he has this very intricate belt on with animals, like woven patterns, and just how intricate it looked seemed to strike me as like odd, for what we're told, they didn't have, the means to make stuff like that. But it seems like more often than not, we find evidence to contradict the mainstream narrative on Native Americans. And as we were talking about in a previous conversation, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that different European cultures have been coming here way before Columbus, not just the Moors, but the Finnish and everyone in between. I mean, the weird part is how these words get all thrown in a grab bag, and they lose their meaning over time. But we're looking at another slide here, the Muskegee. Yes, you talked about this. So,
well, you're talking about,
right?
Please continue. But you're talking about Native Americans that don't look so Native American, as we're told.
Right.
Well, the Muskegee, the Creek, the Seminoles, the Miccosukee, and the Meskwaki, those are up north near Canada, the Meskwaki, and we're told they're unrelated. But you'll see how these very Arabic, Muslim, Moorish-looking people are, in fact, Native Americans. So this is a Creek man, This is a Meskwaki, a Fox tribe, but a Meskwaki Indian that's a turban. That's an Arabic person.
Right. And very fine, what look like silk even clothes. I mean, we obviously this is an artistic rendition and not an actual photo, but I mean, it looks like garments, like very fine garments that they're wearing. Not like what we're told, like buckskins, right? That's the image we're given.
They had a lot of blue and purple. These Muskogee descended people, and the Muskogee go back to the Mexican. That was something that Ben from Analog, Waking Up with Analog, taught me. The Muskogee go back to Mexico, and it's actually the same exact root word, Muskogee, Mexican, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the Muscovites are a group of people in Europe, right? I mean, so there's a connection back there that still exists to this day.
Exactly. You have Muscovy ducks here in Florida. You have Muskogee people. Well, the Muskogee, I believe, are related to the Muscovites of Russia. That's why you have St. Petersburg, Florida, and St. Petersburg, Russia,
right
in the bay, right, Gulf to Gulf. You're right. It's the same exact, taking the Gulf Stream from its source to its end.
Right.
Gulf of Mexico to essentially the Gulf of Finland, the Baltic Sea. That's St. Petersburg to St. Petersburg. Wow. There's your ancient Tartarian Empire right there. And let's look at some more of these guys. That's a Seminole. I don't know how that guy doesn't look very Native American to me. He's got the little deer skin tassels at the bottom, but that is an Arabic looking person. He's got his little dagger there. It looks like scarves, his pashmina, however they pronounce it.
Right. And one thing, that I will say as like a little objection is, obviously there were European people here at this time. They could have brought all kinds of stuff and traded with the natives. We know they traded with the natives. But when you look at these guys, they have mustaches, which I don't think there's many Native Americans that can grow mustaches. So you have that.
Good point.
And then also certain facial features also. I mean, this is a odd science to get into because it borders on, eugenics and anthropology, but there are certain like cranial features or, facial features.
Of course.
That
jaw. Yeah. You can determine racial origin by jaw, the nose bridge, the bridge of the nose, how high the bridge of the nose is. It's a clear determination for what genes you have. And these guys have, not only do they absolutely have North African genes, I see a lot of Indian, what we would call Indian, like from India. And I see what we know they are descended from, largely Celtic people. So believe it or not, the official history of the Muskogee, the Seminoles, the Creek, is that they were kind of a conglomerate tribe that was mixed in with white people that were also dissatisfied with colonial America and went and chose the tribal life. That's what we're told. Now, most of them were like Celtic and were hardcore, either Scottish, Irish, Welsh, and they all mixed in with the Seminole. That's why the most famous Seminole, Osceola, well, that's his tribal name. His real name, his birth name, he was Scottish. His real name was Billy Powell. Now, I think we'll get to him later.
Is this Billy Powell here, or this?
We're gonna get to him. This isn't exactly organized. I think he's later on.
Okay, because I was gonna say this guy kind of looks like David Bowie if he existed in this time period.
This is a Creek Indian, and he's got his either face paint or face tattoos.
Well, his posture is very glam rock. I mean, that's what I'm getting.
It looks like he's wearing a silk kimono.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
A silk turban hat type thing.
Right.
And to go back to the blue and the purple, I should say, it looks like you're wearing purple right now. Basically,
Navy.
the Phoenicians, their claim to fame was that not only were they the best mariners, seamen, but they were the best. They had the only source of purple dye, allegedly, was this precious dye that they would get. Well, people's what do people, do you know what I'm talking about? They point to
Well, there's this whole conversation about how in
it's like sea urchins, right?
Well, that I'm almost certain you're thinking of like Cretacean blood. So certain Cretaceous species.
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
Like the crabs, and there's certain
exactly
blue blood, and that whole.
What I'm getting at is that the true source of this rich blue and sometimes purple is horseshoe crab blood from the west coast of Florida.
Why the west coast of Florida? Because we have horseshoe crabs up here in Long Island Sound. I don't know if all horseshoe crabs have. Yeah, they're endangered because kids are stupid and run around on the beach and crack their shells open. But yeah, they're here. They're for sure here.
Okay, so Tyrian dye comes from sea snails.
The sea snail.
So they say, yeah, you're right. Huh. They said it was sea snails. Well, that's in the Mediterranean, essentially. In the Gulf of Mexico, the equivalent to that would have been this blue blood coming from the
horseshoe crab.
Horseshoe crabs. Thank you.
And horseshoes have an interesting occult lore as well connected to them. But yeah, there's a lot of connections to this blue, because the blue dye thing, people talk about how in classic paintings there is no blue dye. Like they use like colors like wine red to paint the sky because they just didn't have blue, and that leads some people to think that the sky wasn't blue back then. But I mean, I don't know if we could use art to determine what color the sky was, but anyways.
These guys use a lot of blue, and that kind of asserts their status. These people were wealthy, probably traders at one point. Some of these guys, you can see some Asian features, but here we go. Like I was saying, the creek may actually be Greek, because the Greek colonized parts of Florida. That is unknown to many people. New Smyrna, Florida, was an old Greek colony, but it goes a lot farther back than people know. It actually goes back to the English period, when the English were in control in the 1700s.
Wow. So you just, in the last slide you just showed, I noticed that some of the mounds were mentioned. And in one of my past episodes of Esoteric America, we talked about the Etowah mounds and how they found these copper thunderbirds in the mounds. And this is very curious, because a lot of tribes, we're told, didn't have any sort of metallurgy. And, here we go talking about European cultures here in the area, possibly, becoming what we think of as tribes. Obviously, they would have carried some of their, Bronze Age or Copper Age type, metallurgy with them, and would have been able to create those copper thunderbirds that they find in the mountains. So, wow, that's pretty interesting.
There's also the theory, or kind of the realization, that most of the copper that was getting mined out of the Ohio and Mississippi area in inland America is missing from the archaeological record of the Americas. So people believe that was being exported. Historians have always theorized that the Phoenicians were getting all their copper from the Americas. They got their tin from Britain, right? Britain, that's where it gets its name. They were getting their tin from there. And Yeah. What else?
Well, it's fascinating
what
how
else you
we
got?
can. It's fascinating how we can trace, all of these things using phonetic clues, and this is like a type of concept that, I think you could generally refer to it as Twilight language. I'm looking for my book that I had earlier because here it is. Because Sesh Harry mentions a similar concept when he's talking about Florida and how Ed Lee Scanlon's name is Twilight language for something in particular that kind of gives you a clue. And his theory is that Ed Lee Scalhan built this rock gate to sort of fulfill some kind of, Rosicrucian or secret society purpose. And obviously, if you've been to Coral Castle, it's pretty magnificent. A little old man couldn't have done it without some kind of powerful knowledge. And you got to wonder, what sort of forces other than his, lost love compelled him to choose that spot and build that there. Because the conventional story is just, oh, well, Coral Castle is some sort of old man's project because he lost his love in Lithuania or something like that. But if I could find this page, I'll read what his name means in Twilight language, because it was kind of interesting that came up right before we got on the call here. I like to follow the synchronicities, if you couldn't tell, Dr. Longo. So here we go. Here it is. So Ed means riches, ward, Edward. Riches, ward means guardian or castle. Lee means shelter. Squel means skill or wisdom. And Nin means nine, the nine principles of creation in ancient Egyptian myth. So that's this author's interpretation of Edward Lee Scalnan, who built Coral Castle, using supposedly ancient Egyptian knowledge. But if what we're talking about here tracks, I think, what we call Egyptian might as well be called Atlantean, and what we call Florida might as well be called New Atlantis, because that seems to be what these, colonists were trying to do when they came here. I mean, in New England, they tried to do a bunch of these utopian socialist sort of colonies that ended up failing ultimately. Luckily for them, they were absorbed by the United States and all the plans that came from, the deists and the Freemasons. But, this is like, I don't know, maybe we're going off on a limb here, but this is sort of like where this topic becomes really interesting, because the people who founded our country had knowledge of the mounds. They had knowledge of these ancient sort of legends. And then they created organizations like the Smithsonian Institute, which went about giving folks a mainstream narrative that discounted a lot of these, what became fringe aspects of what's here in America. So I think I just took us off on a sort of tangent there, but do you have any comments on that? Anything to add?
So Frank Hamilton Cushing, who did work for the Smithsonian,
right,
came here over 100 years ago, pretty much 120 years ago, over. And he was pretty much the first, you could say, American or European American authority to go out and look at these Florida mounds. So when he was out in Southwest Florida, between Tampa Bay area and basically the Keys, Marco Island, the Marco Island artifacts are artifacts that have, you were just talking about the Egyptians, they have a dog, a jackal dog. It's definitely an Egyptian type dog. An Anubis, pretty much, Anubis, a jackal, a cat, a domesticated cat, and a what was the third one? Well, they have all these masks, all these very weird Pacific-looking masks. And Frank Hamilton Cushing found those, or he was one of the first people to examine them, put together some of the pieces. And he also was, like I said, the first person to go through these mounds. Well, he said flat out, this is a civilization that like rivaled, the Egyptians. They had mound cities, solid limestone, clumped up shell mounds. We call them mounds today and trash piles, but that's not what they were. You don't arrange your trash to the stars, right? So all these mounds are arranged to the stars. Right. And I'll show you some of that.
Well, and while you're pulling that up, I'll say a lot of talk goes on about the Hopewell and Adena cultures and their mound building in between the Mississippi and the Appalachians, but we have shell middens all along the East Coast, from Maine down to Florida. And as you just mentioned, these are not just like happenstance trash piles that just came out for no reason. They're meticulously planned, constructions with a purpose, and yeah, it's fascinating and very telling when you learn that these are, for the most part, ignored even by some alternative people like Graham Hancock and those guys. They don't look at any of this kind of stuff.
Maybe.
I mean,
I'm here guys. If you want your proof of Atlantis, I can show it to you.
Yeah, shout out to Graham.
Yeah, but so just to sum things up, why are we talking about Florida, Atlantis, Muslims, all this? How does this all cross? How does this all intersect? Basically, Atlantis is very likely the source of the Egyptian culture, the Greek culture, the Maya, the Aztec. And if not the origin of those cultures, it definitely shaped them tremendously when the survivors, or the 12 tribes of this or that, the survivors of Atlantis would basically reestablish in contact with these tropical kingdoms, as they're called in the Bach saga, the tropical kingdoms. And, these anchors, the implications of these anchors are huge. Well, that's because in the Mediterranean, the average stone anchor, in Polynesia, the average stone anchor is about 300 pounds. And it's about the size of a backpack. Here in Florida, we have the oldest and the largest stone anchors in the world. They're at least 7,000 years old. And they're about 5,000 pounds plus on average. 10,000, many examples of 10,000 pound anchors. So the size of a ship that's going to need that big, remember those backpack-sized ones that they pull up in the Mediterranean all the time. If you go look up ancient stone anchor, you can see what I'm talking about. Anyone that's listening, ancient stone anchor is a real thing. They just don't admit that they are here in Florida. They don't even acknowledge them. John Saxer had moderate success in like the 2000s, early 2000s, late 90s, getting people to come, experts getting them to come look at them. And they did agree with him. But then it was all hush hush. Nothing got written. Nothing. It was in Ancient American Magazine. If you know Ancient American Magazine, it was in at least one publication of Ancient American.
Yeah,
magazine.
No, I think we've had, I don't know how closely associated Rick Osman is with that publication. I think he works with them as a writer. We've had him on the show before, and he talks about similar subjects, something we brought up in our last conversation, which can be found on your channel, right? The Coquina, or actually was it Juan's channel? I think it was for Juan's channel. Either way, I'll put the link in the description. But we mentioned that saga, that sort of concept, that sort of particular area.
Mm-hmm. So, Atlantis ties into Phoenicia, because Phoenicians are these sea people who came from somewhere else and colonized the Mediterranean. It's obvious because they just hugged the interior of the Mediterranean. They had no territory to establish this empire from until they had seized that land. Maybe they were native, who knows? The Phoenicians were not African in the sense that we would think. These people largely had European DNA because they were descended from Finnish Vikings. So Finnish Vikings came from the north, south to North Africa and Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, and established colonies. And once we're in the Mediterranean, we call them Phoenicians. Well, it's the same culture. If you look at their language, it's obvious. The runes, there's rune stones that are all over the world. And then there's Phoenician stelas, however they pronounce it, stelas. And I can show you some of those, actually.
Yeah, tell me about these. What is, for people who don't know, what's a stele?
It's basically a stone that has a runic inscription on it.
Okay.
And Phoenician is pretty much identical to runic. That's why, like I said earlier, Phoenician, when it was being used in North Africa, was called Punic. Mm. That's why when the Romans were fighting the Phoenicians in North Africa, it was the Punic Wars.
Right.
Well, the Romans were also fighting who? The barbarians in the north, the Vikings, right?
Right. Right. And we talk about all these, so-called pirates who, ravaged the Caribbean, the colonial days, and even in the colonies too. And, some of these were barbarian pirates. And it's like, well, do you think the pirates just followed Columbus and everybody over here, or were they already here? Maybe they had ships here already and they were Native American folks who were,
Well, pirate culture is a direct continuation of Phoenician culture.
Wow.
These people who stuck to their ships,
right?
They traded. They were accused of looting. They might not have always been looting in the sense that we think, and just robbing people and being up to no good. As we know, privateers is just a nice name for a pirate. So the pirates were being employed by governments.
Right, like a mercenary in a way.
Mercenaries, exactly.
Well, and even today with yachts and such, I'm sure you're well aware, being in Florida, here in Connecticut, we have definitely a yacht culture that, exists probably because of New York City. But, yachts kind of drift along this boundary of legal, gray area because, as soon as they leave port, they're, lawless, so to speak. And I think there's plenty of wealthy people who would like to take advantage of that loophole. And some people argue that there are whole groups of people who live on solely ships, and they're like breakaway civilizations. So if those exist today, here an example would be like the whole Ghislaine Maxwell terra firma thing, or maybe I'm not getting the name of that right, but she had some sort of group that was interested in creating like an ocean civilization that was not bound by any one body of land. So it's very strange how these things, repeat themselves throughout history. But here's a Finnish runestone. Now, where was this found?
In Finland. This is runic. Okay. This is Phoenician. This is a Phoenician stele or stele, stella. I don't know. People pronounce it differently. Basically, this is a runestone. They just won't call it a runestone. And the academics, or the sacademics, as I like to call them, They will jump through any hoop they need to in order to obscure the truth.
Right.
For example, Phoenician. Well, if you asked someone to spell that offhand, they would probably start with an F, right? Phoenician. And they probably wouldn't put an O as the first vowel either.
Right.
Well, what you have here is an example of phonetic obscuring, where they're obscuring the phonetic identity of both of these words.
Well, when I think of faux, I mean, it sounds also like the word fake, which is sort of kind of implied that they're faking something.
Phony.
When they call them the Phoenicians, either faking the truth.
Yeah, phony, for sure.
Yeah.
That definitely has a, has a meaning in this too. But that is Finnish. F-I-N, Finnish. Well, it seems like they're jumping through hoops to not spell Phoenician with an F and an I, because then it would be so obvious that these are the same culture.
Right.
So they spell it P-H-O-E-N, Phoenician.
It's interesting that this also in this stele that you're showing us here, there's a sort of spiral pattern that the characters follow. Now, the one that you just had, if you notice, like it's sort of squared, but it starts down at the bottom right corner there, and then it goes up like a spiral and comes into itself. And I wonder if there's a way, because different languages start their reading from different angles, right? Japanese people read from right to left. We in the Western world, for the most part, read from left to right. And French people's books titles are upside down. There's all kinds of little clues with the way you structure language. I wonder if there's something to that. I have a quick image I'd like to share real quick, just to show you that maybe there's an example of this up here in New England as well. This is the Dighton Rock, which was found in a riverbed in Massachusetts, and the people who went to study it, they didn't think that it was Native American, but considering everything we're talking about here today, it could be a sort of amalgamation of rune and maybe other characters, and that's why it doesn't fit into any of the traditional, what we would think of as Native American symbols or language characters. But yeah, this is the one relief of this, I think, on the other side, or maybe it's just not clear here, but it looks like there's a sword, like a broadsword, that's depicted on this rock somewhere. So that's where people think maybe it has something to do with Vikings and their iron swords, or But yeah, there's ample evidence of this. Even, there's a site in Connecticut that my aunt used to live right on the side of this mountain, where they found Hebrew inscriptions at the top of the rock. And obviously would you call them academics? They love to, write everything off as a hoax if it doesn't fit into their narrative. So they called this, Hebrew inscription a hoax, but it exists in a place where, you have several mountain peaks over a very deep old lake. It's, what am I thinking? Which lake? How am I forgetting the name? Lake Warramug. Thank you, Tara. Lake Warramug in Connecticut, for people that don't know this area. There's a very old lake, and the legend is that when European settlers came into this area, the native chief who ran shop in this area had a longhouse that was the most exquisite piece of architecture that these European colonists had ever seen. They were invited in, and they were showing all this artwork. It was, the dimensions were like 15 by 25 feet. And, this is they called it like a stately sort of, which was a high compliment for, considering that they considered most of these Indian structures just like stick huts. They held this one in high regard. So yeah, there's so much evidence of a more advanced culture here in America throughout at least the eastern seaboard. That's where we're focusing here today. But Yeah, man. I really like the number of videos I saw. I haven't watched them all, but if you were to, present another example of why you think Florida is Atlantis, is there anywhere we haven't covered so far? I mean, we've talked about the stone anchors. We've talked about, I can think of one, the Garden of Eden and then Bach Tower. This is kind of pertinent to me because I found a postcard last year of the Bach Tower right after learning about the Bach saga, and I sort of thought, oh, maybe there's a connection here. Not so much. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, at least historically, there's no like direct lineage between anyone in the Bach, family and the Bach Tower, but it is odd that they have the same name.
I think all Bachs are descended from the same house, the family, group of families. So your Bachs with the B-A-C-H, like Sebastian Bach, composer.
Wow, yeah.
Basically, that's the same family. He had royal blood. He was of the nobility. And this Bach, B-O-K, in Florida, the Bach Tower, that guy, I believe, is Danish or Dutch. He's Dutch. So he's Dutch. Well, Bach, the other Bach, is Eeyore Bach from the Bach saga. He's from Finland. Well, as I already established the connection between Finland and Florida, because the Finns established a colony here in Lake Worth, Florida, because they were following the Gulf Stream back to what I would say is their roots, this ancient tradition of crossing the Atlantic. And the Garden of Eden, you say Atlantis. How does Atlantis tie into the Garden of Eden? That's because the Garden of Eden is a direct ripoff of the Greek myth, the Garden of Hesperides. The word paradise comes directly from Hesperides. Hesperides became paradise. Paradise. And so the Garden of the Hesperides became the Garden of Paradise. And they had a tree with a snake on it with a golden apple. Well, that was an orange. The word orange in Greek, Finnish, Russian, Jewish, Hebrew, whatever types of Hebrew they speak. And I already said Finnish, Latin as well. Orange means golden apple. The golden apple of mythology is the orange. They established this for sure. It's only in Western Europe, kind of, where it really took hold that it was a red apple. And I'm not sure why that is, but probably to obscure the fact that this was a Greek myth. And the Greeks did have apples, but to indicate it as an orange would have shown that it might have stemmed from an Atlantean origin, the Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians introduced citrus to all these other cultures as well.
Right, and that's so strange considering that, Disney, which is so famous and has made such an impact on, American culture in the last 100 years, they find themselves in the two places in the United States that are most famous for their oranges, right? You have the orange groves out in California, and you have the very famous Florida oranges. So
Orange County,
right,
or Orlando. Is in Orange County.
And there's Florida. Even the House of Orange, which made kind of an impact. I mean, I live not too far from a town called Orange, Connecticut, and there's plenty of places all over the country named Orange. It's just a very common town name. And I wonder if that connects to maybe the royal name or possibly this myth that we're in the new Atlantis. Because you see this over and over again with the toponyms across, especially the East Coast, where you have maybe biblical names inserted or other sort of old world names. Speaking of names, what's their name? This
is Arione.
Arione. Hello, cat. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast cast.
The podcast.
There you go.
Yeah. So, what were you saying? Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah. We got caught up on cats. That's fine. I kind of lost track with what I was.
Well, we could talk about cats. The Marco Island artifact shows what I believe to be domesticated cats.
Right. You said it was a jackal type dog, a cat, and one other one. Do you remember now what that other one was? Could it have been like a Osirian kind of hawk or a falcon?
It was an ibis.
Thoth.
It was a wading bird.
Thoth.
Exactly. So these are all like Egyptian deities that cross over to Florida.
Wow.
And this is, the Nile is the Mississippi. The Nile and the Mississippi. If the Mississippi is not the original Nile, then it's definitely the equivalent and has an equivalent amount of history, and when you look at the commonalities, you have alligators and crocodiles, right? You have citrus growing in both areas, pretty much. You have... what was I going to say?
Well, we were just talking about
wading birds. Yes. The wading birds, and you Flamingos. Say, as you pointed out earlier, there's many ecological similarities, and even like geological similarities between Florida and Egypt, and the Yucatan of Mexico. But basically, this breadbasket, the Gulf of Mexico, we believe is the true Fertile Crescent. It is exactly crescent shaped, and it is very fertile. And there's an abundance of fresh water, spring water. Now, to tie it back to the Garden of Eden, what would I look for in the Garden of Eden? I'd look for subtropical weather, not too hot where you're getting roasted all day. I'd look for an abundance of tropical fruit. I'd look for a bunch of spring water, freshest, cleanest, healthiest spring water in the world, and the most in the world here in Florida. I would look for maybe giant skeletons. Well, you have a lot of those here in Florida. I would look for things like that.
What makes you say that last part? Because that's something that you don't just walk across, your average forest and stumble upon a giant skeleton. That's an indication of very ancient civilizations, I imagine. Is that what you're suggesting, or just?
Yeah. Let me. Here, I'm going to pull up a slide.
Because we have legends from the Native Americans of giants being, not so friendly. So, I mean, for me, if I found giant skeletons, I might check that place off on the list as not a good, suitable, safe place. But I don't know. It depends on how friendly the giants are. As you've pointed out numerous times in other shows, I am maybe a giant myself, so I don't know what that says about me. But
well, yeah, you got the blood. You got the Nephilim blood.
Oh, God, don't say that. A lot of my audience is afraid of Nephilim, so.
No, it's nothing bad. Nephilim's not. It has a bad interpretation for sure. Right. If you're going according to that interpretation of the fallen angel, being actual evil entities. But once you realize it probably has a lot to do with Atlantis as well. You had mixing of races, some of the earliest mixing of races. And in Europe today, we see white. Well, that's not actually the purest white. And we go to Africa and we see black. Well, that's not actually the purest black. And you see it in some instances. But when these ancient unmixed races mixed, you might have had the potential for absurdly large offspring, because that happens with dog breeding very often, is when when species are being intentionally bred, they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point, you actually mate the two smallest things, and you might I might be thinking of plants that they definitely do that with certain plant species where you have the smallest two offspring mate with each other, and you can actually get the largest as a result.
Wow.
Well, you look for giants and what are perhaps gnomes or elves. People, kind of roll their eyes when they hear that stuff, but very short people were common in the ancient world. Now, you were talking about Ed Leedskalnin. Well, he may have some of this gnome blood, or this elvish, or this fairy blood. These little people that were workers of the earth, maybe stone, stuff like that. Well, what if I told you? Did you know that Juan Ponce de Leon was under 5 feet tall?
Really? Well, they always make fun of Napoleon for allegedly being short when in actuality
he wasn't even that short.
He was actually pretty tall compared to most people. But so Ponce de Leon was, that doesn't
4'11".
I mean, there's a lot of that tracks with.
That's like Snooki
Wow.
height.
Yeah, but that's not that unusual.
What we're looking at right now is giant skeletons being found in Florida in old Florida newspapers. And yeah, I've got more than this. If you look at my Instagram, I've got a lot more than this. They're just not all on my laptop.
Right.
What else we got? And those giant anchors would have needed giants to use them, or people with advanced technology. Of course, that's a possibility too. But Eden and Atlantis. Well, you've got lots of snakes here, right? I should have said that too. And the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization. They make all these excuses how the Fertile Crescent is not fertile anymore, how the rivers are diverted, it's not irrigated the way it was in ancient times. And, well, Florida and the Gulf of Mexico is very fertile, very, very fertile. You can grow just about anything in Florida. The weather is very temperate. A video that I'm going to be doing that you have exclusive information on, new conspiracy. It's the biggest conspiracy in the world, actually. Florida is not hot.
Really?
Florida is not hot.
It's humid.
Well, yeah. But Florida is not hot. And if you ask anyone in America, can you list off some of the hottest cities? They would probably say Miami, right? Pretty high on that list. Well, what if I told you that it has only once ever gone over 100 degrees in Miami?
Wow.
And that was in the 1940s. Why is that? It does get hot here. It does get humid, but it will always average out in the mid 90s, even on the hottest days. And on average in the mid 80s, mid 70s. Whereas in all of the states that receive very, very cold winters, all of them will go well over 100 degrees every year, year after year. And people don't talk about that. They just kind of accept it.
Yeah.
Well, Nebraska will go to 110 degrees.
Right.
Very often. Ohio, New Hampshire even, well into the hundreds, right? And sometimes they'll go 20 below zero, even more, some of these states. That's a span of, over 100 degrees, essentially. That's not very good for the human body. This is not like an ice bath, right? It's good to take an ice bath every once in a while. But on the grand scale, that is terrible for the human body. And living in a temperate zone where the temperature swing, the variation, is only about 30 degrees, that is very good for the body. That is very good for the organs. It's good for the skin. It's good for everything. being too deep in the tropics brings many problems. Too much heat, too much sun exposure. You know, rainforests are nice, but you cannot just sustain yourself like a civilized person out in one unless you're willing to revert back to tribal, attitudes towards things, which is okay. But what was I talking about?
You're talking about how, Florida would have been a desirable place because it doesn't fluctuate. And the further you go into which you can't really go. I mean, even the Keys are probably within that range of really nice weather. I don't imagine Florida has any crazy jungles that would, the Everglades are certainly wild, but.
So the peninsula is so skinny, Florida itself, with water on either side, ocean water, and so much abundant fresh water oozing up from its springs that it is impossible pretty much for it to stay over 100 degrees. The air moves so easily across the state that hot air can never just rest over the state. Whereas Nebraska, Idaho, these type of states where it's just like barren, wheat fields and cornfields and stuff,
right.
You're just getting baked by summer sun. Florida actually gets less heat in the summer and less cold in the winter. So that's
there's an argument to be made that you can look at the United States from west to east, sort of like a gradient of desertification, where what we're looking at in what are the plain states is the signs of inevitable desert, right? So that's kind of a scary thought, but I have been told by one past guest, and I've heard this on other interviews, certain people talk about how at one point a squirrel could have gone from the east coast to the west coast of the United States without ever touching the ground. There are so many trees here. And, this is a big topic in the whole Great Reset thing, is that there are these great cataclysms. Up here in New England, we've had several cataclysmic hurricanes that destroyed a lot of the old, historic trees. The charter oak was one that has a sort of important legacy connected to the United States Constitution. So there's definitely an argument to be made that we're living in sort of a barren, vastly changing landscape. I don't know if I'm down with the climate change people, but I certainly agree that, something's going on with these wild storms.
Agreed. The storms, you could talk about storms from so many angles. But one that's important is the giant trees that used to be in Florida. Those acted as a natural break wind for pretty much the eastern United States. These bald cypress trees that were giant, in some cases as big as redwoods and sequoias, but often twice as old.
Wow.
So, they average to be older than redwoods and sequoias.
Right.
But those would deflect or neutralize hurricanes as they hit the coast of Florida, as they entered the Gulf of Mexico or tried to. Well, without those ancient giant trees, and I'm going to show you some of those giant trees in a sec.
Now,
but
one thing I just want to ask, because I've noticed this during storms and at certain weird places that Tara and I have visited, there are large trees that seem to be very old, where it looks like people either had a sort of effort to place these rocks in the roots so that it would be like an anchor to hold down the tree. And it makes sense that you might want to do that if you're living in an area with a lot of storms. But do you think that these cypress trees that were all over Old World Florida were a part of that Atlantean civilization, like a natural break wall that maybe were destroyed as the colonists sort of set in and ignorantly thrashed things around?
Agreed. The storms, you could talk about storms from so many angles. But one that's important is the giant trees that used to be in Florida. That those acted as a natural break wind for pretty much the eastern United States. These bald cypress trees that were giant, in some cases as big as redwoods and sequoias, but often twice as old. So, Well, if you think about Cyprus, Cyprus gets its name from Cyprus, the Phoenician colony in the island in the Mediterranean.
Wow.
So Cyprus with a U, Cyprus. The cypress tree was the sacred holy tree to the Phoenicians, the Greek, the Turks, and you have turkeys in Florida, right? Lots of turkeys. Turkey got its name from Turkey, and allegedly we're told that they saw this bird. They thought that it was exotic, and they named it a turkey, right? That's what we're told. But we're talking about the Garden of Eden, and I wanted to show this article. It's a land advertisement from 1911 that is advertising the Tarpon Springs area as the original Garden of Eden. And this guy's angle, how he arrived at that belief, was looking at the temperatures, that it's the most equable climate in the United States, as I was just talking about. Well, Florida climate proves that original Garden of Eden was located there. Original Garden of Eden. I have underlined right there.
Wow. Mr. Edmonds. Who's this guy?
I don't know. This is just some guy who wrote an article, but he got very impassioned once he got into this. It became like a religious zeal. I don't know how religious he was before, but just by looking at the temperatures, he was like, my God, how can a place be so natural to live in? You could pretty much live naked in the Tampa Bay area very, very comfortably. It's not going to get as hot as some of the other southern parts of Florida. It can, but it's much more temperate, and it has a little more elevation. Miami has no elevation, but still, remember, only went over 100 degrees one time in the 1940s. That's a conspiracy. That's propaganda in my mind. They want people thinking Florida is just this hot, barren, and it's hot, it's humid, you'll sweat for sure. But let's see what else we've got. So that was just going off of the temperature and the climate. Someone came to the realization this might be the real Garden of Eden. Now, back before the 1900s, they were writing in newspapers all the time about how there were these ancient civilizations buried in Florida. Mound builders, right? Hopewell culture, Mississippi mound building culture, Ohio River Valley culture. These are all like Egyptian scale empires, civilizations. The Maya, or who we call the Maya, extended into Florida without a doubt. That's Miami. But here we have the Garden of Eden being asserted that Florida is the Garden of Eden by a man named E.E. Calloway. And E.E. Calloway, he looked at the Bible's description of Eden, and he felt that it was describing the area of Bristol, Florida. And the main crux of his theory is what's called gopher wood or gopher wood. In the Old Testament, Noah's Ark was made from gopher wood. Well, here in northwestern Florida, you have gopher wood. So phonetically, that's the same word, and he knew this.
Now,
and yeah.
Well, if you're about to get to this, maybe the rivers that you're showing us here, they have two names on either side. I'm imagining that one of them is the biblical comparison, and the other is what they call it, in the present location. So we have the Euphrates, the Jinon River, the Midexel River, and the Pison River. Those are all the biblical names for these rivers. Wow.
The Hiddekel.
Oh, okay.
The Pison, the Hiddekel, the Euphrates, and the Ginon.
Right. Wow.
Ginon. And he believes this is the only four-headed river system in the world that he could find on a map, where you have a four-headed natural river system. That dam was put in there, but that's a natural four-headed river system.
Now, before the dam was there, it would have been probably like a floodplain and not like a single river. It would have maybe been a larger river, or even maybe like multiple rivers coming out of that.
I don't know.
Huh.
I can't speak to that, but this is E.E. Calloway right here.
Okay.
And these are the signs. The government actually got on board with a lot of his theories, the state government and local government of Bristol, Florida, which is just west of Tallahassee, I believe, along the banks of the Apalachicola River. Mm. Well, the Apalachicola River has the same root as the Appalachian Mountains and the Appalachian culture, right? Well, what if I told you that is the apple of Eden? And this is the river of Eden, the Apalachicola.
Wow.
And so the government got on board and started putting those signs up. But I wanted to read this too. This is from Hilton Hotema. This man, he's a breatharian. He is a occultist mystic, and he wrote many publications, many I don't know what you call them, blogs, I guess, books, many books. They were compiled into books, his writings. They're hard to get, but Hilton Hotema is worth a search if you guys are looking for some interesting stuff, especially about breatharianism, vegetarianism, fruitarianism. As you can see there, basically the steps to going towards breatharian. And he believed in order to be breatharian, you needed a climate which would allow you to do so, or even to just be healthy. So that's what I was talking about before, about the temperate zones, where the climate does not fluctuate so drastically.
Right.
Is best for the human, but to live in naturally, without artificial pampering and artificial aid, stuff like that. So he wrote this, or at least he published this about Florida. Empire of the Sun. Why is Florida destined to rise to greater heights of any other state of this nation? Because she has the same isothermal zone as did ancient Thebes and Luxor when they flourished in the valley of the mystic Nile. The same as that of Babylonia the Magnificent, with her hanging gardens on the banks of the Euphrates, when she ruled a continent. The same as that of Jerusalem, the holy city of Palestine, with its fabulous wealth and templed shrines when Solomon reigned in all his glory. The same as that of Athens, when she was the intellectual capital of the world and crowned with architectural splendor the hills of classic Greece. The same as that of Carthage, when she disputed the sovereignty of the world with imperial Rome. The same as that of Naples, and I think it goes on to the other page. But, so that's a compelling argument.
Right.
And especially in our modern situation, political situation, Florida is a bright beacon of reason, a beacon of truth, freedom, standing up to the tyranny. I'm very proud to be Floridian in these times. I love our governor. Boo-hoo if you don't like him. But I love what he stands for, and I think that Florida is doing its best to live up to these type of expectations. If you have a perfect climate like this, where you can pretty much get whatever you want done, you should be taking advantage of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it definitely feels like it's been a sought after place, and it has held a special place in American history. I mean, some of the oldest continuous cities or contiguous cities are in Florida, going back all the way to the early 1500s. So Yeah, I mean, we only mentioned Ponce de Leon very briefly and him being very short, but he's very well known for the whole Fountain of Youth thing. And some people, say that, oh, okay, it's in St. Augustine or it's somewhere near there. I know you've done a video on St. Augustine. Is there a particular location, or do you think they were just describing the general area of Florida for its aquifers? Just in general, the whole area has that quality to it, or is it punctuated with a really precise spot where you get the full effect? Do you think that place actually exists, or is it just mythology?
Yeah, there's definitely allegorical, symbolic, transcendental interpretations where, there doesn't have to be a physical fountain. Sure, there's processes in the human body that people would refer to as the fountain of youth, right? The elixir of life. And that's okay. That all of that remains true. All of that holds true. Just because Shakespeare wrote about King Henry does not mean that King Henry did not exist, right? So people need to understand that a allegory does not negate the literal interpretation. So, but if we're looking for a literal interpretation, I can say confidently, Florida is the only landmass that fits that bill of a land of infinite flowing spring water. Such abundant spring water that, Nestle, Coca-Cola, all of these companies have gone in and have sucked out millions of gallons a day. And that's sad, and that should be, have an end put to it. But it doesn't even make a dent, pretty much. Each of these springs pumps out thousands of gallons every couple hours. Some of them 1 million gallons a day. It's absurd.
Wow.
So Ginny Springs, you have all these springs. But to answer your question, is it one specific spring? I have a good idea of one that I think might have been significant to Juan Ponce de Leon, because in a picture, he's pictured along one that has a kind of a rock wall. And there's only one that I know of that I've seen, and I've seen a large majority of the ones in Florida, not in person, but through compiling them for the videos. And I can show you which ones I'm talking about. I'm going to share my screen right now. You see me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where is that?
Your very lovely Apple desktop background.
Oh man, my tab went away. Oh, here we are. Okay, sorry. That's my background, by the way. I don't know why. But, God damn it, what'd I do? Okay, so these are just Florida springs in general.
Wow.
Now, most people have never seen or heard of these, especially if they don't live in Florida. People's image of Florida is just mucky swampland, right? Sawgrass and swamp. Well, pretty much the whole inland of central northern Florida and the Panhandle is littered with the most abundant springs in the world.
Wow.
Okay.
This is where the manatees are living.
Highest concentration of freshwater springs in the world.
Wow.
All these little rivers are real life lazy rivers that flow very, very slow. Perfect for canoeing. This is paradise.
And
this
you
is
can
what
just you could just put a cup in there and drink out of it, or would people maybe sterilize it first?
In most instances, yes. No.
Wow.
They would probably advise against that.
Right. Of course they would. But they'd have us putting Clorox in it if they really wanted to.
So all these pictures have not been altered. That is the true color of Florida spring water. Why? Because it has traces of lime in it. So lime, not squeezed lime we're saying
limestone,
fragments of limestone, pretty much like quartz crystal dust.
Wow.
And this crystal dust catches sunlight and it glows turquoise, teal, blue. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these pictures definitely look like larger than life. I've only been to Florida as a kid, so, never seen any of this in person. It definitely makes me want to get down there and see for myself. But wow, yeah, that's incredible. I mean, we have some very clear water here in Connecticut. Like a lot of our streams are, you could see the bottom of them, which is cool. But yeah, I mean, most people would probably boil the water before they drank it, just because.
I think you need to take some time to get used to naturally occurring fresh spring water. There might be some pathogens,
right.
But
that's what our immune system is for.
Exactly. We should be at the point where we can drink from fresh spring water.
Right.
And if it gets you sick, you're probably just adjusting. You're not dying.
Well, and what's so fascinating about the quartz aspect to it is like, there's a kind of occult knowledge of using crystals in water and kind of like, charging your water. But you really could not, mimic these effects of like millions and millions of pounds of quartz, being filtered through this water and into dust. I mean, it must have a really profound effect on your health, considering we have a very mineral component to our own bodies. I mean, our body could take minerals from our food and create bone, So obviously, if we're drinking water with quartz in it, that's going to have a beneficial effect on our bone structure, right? I mean, if you have quartz, it's the hardest on the M.E.S.S.I.S scale of hardness, and now you're integrating that into your anatomy. I mean, that's the making of a giant, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's not exactly quartz. It's the same minerals that compose quartz and limestone, calcite and aragonite.
Aragonite. Okay, very cool.
Aragonite. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I've heard of those. I mean, maybe those are the ones. But also, going back to something we talked about previously, if you have this water that's rich in, this lime quality, I imagine that makes your geopolymer work even better, right? If you're using this water to make this coquina geopolymer stuff, huh? I mean, that's something we haven't really touched on here, but a big part of this theory is maybe that these stone structures they were building were geopolymers.
Yeah. I'm going to go search one of those up. But right here on the right, you see this kind of rock wall with the spring oozing out of it. Well, back in there's a cave. There's a painting, a etching, I'm not sure, of Juan Ponce de Leon being led up to pretty much this exact area.
Wow.
And you would only be able to know that if you've been there and seen it. But it's one of the only instances where you have a wall, a cave, and the spring is oozing out of that cave. And there's a picture of Juan Ponce de Leon going up to that. Not a picture, sorry, a painting. But this is what it is. So I'm not saying this is the Fountain of Youth, but it's beautiful. This is Kelly Park Rock Springs in Apopka, Florida. I've been here a couple times. But basically, sorry, what was the last thing? Okay, the coquina, the geopolymer.
Right.
Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. Actually, most of St. Augustine is made out of this very, very unique coquina. Sorry, what's it called? Cast coquina or coquina mix.
Now that's the white sort of facade we're seeing along like the building's made of? Not the red roof. It's the
No, so
white material?
the red is actually something similar. It's
Okay.
terracotta,
Okay.
or a type of terracotta,
Which is clay,
which
essentially,
is
right?
exactly is kind of, yeah, like sculpted brick, essentially similar to brick. The red might indicate a large amount of iron
Hmm.
in that mix. But the gray or the white, the bare wall that you're seeing, all of that terracotta is just like trim, tiles, trim, embellishments. Underneath it is a solid monolithic. This is one of the only monolithic buildings in the world. So this entire building is a monolith, meaning it's essentially a single pour of concrete.
Wow.
But this is not just any normal concrete. It has crushed up shell mixed into it, limestone. Limestone just means crushed up shell. Crushed up shell. Shell is just essentially kind of like little dirty crystals being clumped up together to make a shell. Well, then the shell gets crushed up and clumped together to make limestone with lots of other bits and pieces. When you crush that up and cast it on purpose with cement and concrete mix and something like boric acid, you get this extremely strong, like phenomenal type of concrete cement. When you cast it, you're essentially casting limestone. Someone that knows how to make this can cast something as hard as bedrock. And that building that we're looking at right here, the Ponce de Leon Hotel, today still stands. It was built allegedly built 1887, and it's still standing today. It looks brand new. Brand new. It's extraordinary. And this is a solid stone building.
Wow.
Like that is a solid monolithic building.
Now, have you been to the site and visited?
Yes, I've been there.
Wow.
I've been there a couple times.
Does it have, because we've talked to folks on this show who have been to megalithic sites before, Freddie Silva, David Elkington, just to name a few. There's definitely more. And Howdy Mikowski, even, who's going to be on the show very soon again. They talk about this feeling that you have when you're in the megalithic structure, and they took this hotel and made it into a college, right? So very interesting, that transition. What does it feel like there at the Flagler College?
So all of St. Augustine feels great to me. It gives you such a good vibe. That's my opinion. Because I'm saying it's my opinion because St. Augustine is regarded as one of the most haunted cities in the world.
Wow.
Well, that's kind of what you'd expect, considering it's the oldest American city. So that might just come with the territory. But when you take into consideration like the Bermuda Triangle, Atlantis, all of these old myths, legends, they're essentially ghost stories. And that's all kind of getting, the epicenter of that is St. Augustine, where all these old monolithic buildings and stuff are haunted, essentially. They have like a higher rate of haunting. And that might be due to the material that the whole city's made out of.
Right.
Because this coquina rock is extra conductive. Even normal concrete is conductive to a little degree. Or grounding. If you're into grounding, walking barefoot, concrete is actually better than wood, believe it or not. Because it transmits more electricity. Not always, not all types of wood, but it's better than asphalt, that's for sure. And if you take that into consideration with the fact that they're mixing large amounts of shell and what you could maybe call crystal into this mix, well, it has a larger potential for spiritual, mystical residues, phantom residues, if you're into that type of stuff. It's not definitely my expertise, ghost things or anything like that, but it's a huge part of St. Augustine. If you ever go there, it's like ghost tours. Everyone's taking a ghost tour,
Yeah, no, it's certainly a point of fascination for me as it pertains to the topic of high strangeness and how certain areas generate this phenomena, and the area is actually more worth researching the history rather than maybe like the encounters themselves, which tend to be very personal, very firsthand, and not exactly the best evidence. Now, this is something that the Tartaria heads who are here for that part of this conversation, they're all getting very excited seeing this image of a star fort in St. Augustine. So what's the scoop on this, man? I mean, I don't personally subscribe very much to the whole every star fort is a part of some ancient empire, but they are marvelous to look at, and I don't discount the idea that they have a structural energy that may be placed for a specific purpose in specific areas, right? I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. The fact, like using ley lines, and you have a building with this sort of geometry, you can sort of orient it towards certain positions, maybe even just basically north, south, east, west, or maybe, I don't know if anyone's done this, but if you connect all of the star forts, maybe they transect one another's points, right? You can sort of graph them out in that way. But what's the scoop on this St. Augustine star fort?
Well, my friend Ben from Analog can probably do a good job of explaining how they might be laid out and arranged from like a grand scale, from like a bird's eye view, if that's what you mean, like plotting them, kind of like connect the dots. Yeah. I'm gonna be doing stuff like that with Ben from Analog, Waking Up with Analog. But to go back to what you said about feelings, good feelings, the best feelings I got, the best five, bruh, was in the Castillo de San Marco in St. Augustine. All of St. Augustine to me was very calming and peaceful. Just the stone buildings in general do that. But what you also have is, I forget what I was saying. Well,
this star fort, I will point out, looks sort of pale, even has a white glow to it. Is this made out of coquina? Is this the star fort?
It is.
Okay, cool.
So this is coquina rock. Wow. This is actual blocks of bedrock.
Wow.
Of coral.
So not
rock.
Geopolymer sort of cement. This is
maybe it's possible, because if you go deep enough down this rabbit hole, you realize limestone is just naturally cast cement.
Right.
If you can cast that same mix manually, well, if the finished product was done the right way, you might not even be able to tell natural limestone from coquina mix. Wow. And these blocks, and that's what the pyramids are, essentially. Right. The pyramids very well may have been cast, poured, blocks being poured, then placed, or placed with a mold, then poured into. So they're just, and there's many different theories on that.
No, I've heard the same from other guests, and I tend to agree. I mean, it doesn't make sense unless there was some sort of different landscape in the desert that they would have hauled all those gigantic stones as far as they did, even if they had water to do it.
So this fort has It's Kakina blocks. So it's about blocks the size of like a backpack, a laptop, a big brick block that you'd expect to see in like a government building. That's that size. And these blocks are made from the limestone bedrock. Here's a good example. This seawall alone is a engineering feat. This is in order to build this seawall down into the water, about 300 years ago, is pretty extraordinary. 400 years ago, maybe. And they've added additions since then, and those later additions look terrible compared to the original Kakina rock blocks that they used in the seawall and the fort itself. Now, this is important because much of St. Augustine, like the city walls and the sidewalks and these little walls in between different buildings and stuff, they're made out of these blocks too. And it's kind of just like the leftover blocks got used for walls and stuff like that. And I'll show you what I mean.
So we're typing in St. Augustine City Gate, 1900. Dr. Longo is still relying on Google, hasn't made the switch to DuckDuckGo or another platform yet, but that's okay. We won't hold that against him. So we're looking at the old gate. Wow, okay. This, I mean, to me, looks like a poured sort of concrete. But
well,
maybe
we're told these are just blocks of Kakina bedrock. And you see that castle in the middle there? In the background?
Yep.
Well, let's go take a look at that guy.
The Castle Warden.
That's Castle Warden.
Wow.
This building is made out of poured concrete. And today, it's Ripley's Believe It or Not.
The original auditorium for Ripley's Believe It or Not. How many times have I said Ripley's Believe It or Not in the past month? I've been, every time I talk about when I first started getting into weird stuff, it all goes back to a copy of Ripley's Believe It or Not that I found in my elementary school.
So this is all of these poured, I should have said this, all of these poured buildings are Moorish style.
Right.
Moorish revival architecture.
Right.
Well, they're also the first poured concrete buildings in the world.
Wow.
The St. Augustine area.
And that's where Ripley's Believe It or Not has its headquarters. How long have they been there? What was it before that? It was a castle owned by some wealthy Spanish person?
It was the partner to Henry Flagler. William Warden, I believe his name was.
Okay.
I could be wrong. But Franklin W. Smith had Castle Zoreda in St. Augustine. And Villa Zoreda is a Moorish castle that he allegedly just built for fun, for no reason. First poured concrete building ever, possibly. And he made it in Moorish style for no reason, just because. Well, then Henry Flagler moved to town. He saw it and he was like, well, dude, you've got to teach me how to pour this stuff. So they decided to make hotels together, and those were the two hotels I was just showing you. The Juan Ponce de Leon Hotel and the Hotel Alcazar was the other one I was showing for a little. And then Castle Warden was made as a private home, allegedly. Also Moorish style, in the same technique. So this is the original building that this technique was developed for, to cast this castle. And what's a castle? A castle is not built. It is cast. It's right there in the word.
Right.
A castle So these are true castles. These are truer castles than anywhere else in the world, because these are not built or erected.
Yeah.
These are cast. So a castel.
Well, and could this be evidence for maybe what we're told are castles in Europe maybe having a different process of construction? I mean, not all of them. I mean, some people imagine like the stone fortresses, right, which are kind of like crude brick, large blocks with big, huge wooden posts and whatnot. But there are some incredible works of architecture in European castles that seem to be only possible if they're sculpting and casting them. I mean, some of the shapes that they make are pretty incredible. But wow, this is the first Presbyterian church, or the Flagler Memorial for Presbyterian Church. I don't know where first came from.
Yeah, Flagler Memorial Presbyterian Church, St. Augustine. Built in the same year, essentially 1887, 1888, around there. And this thing, look at it. It's just sitting in the middle of nothing. Glorious, glorious architecture straight out of Rome. This was built in the late 1880s, allegedly, out of the same cast technique in a Moorish, partly Moorish style. Moorish influenced style.
Right. Now you say allegedly, and I don't mean to push back on that because I know you're not like the sole representative of every Tartarian theory out there, but that's a big assertion that's made. It's like, okay, these buildings, we're told they're built at a certain time, but actually they're older. And we talked about how at the beginning of this conversation, how Columbus is sort of like, we're psyop to believe that Columbus was the first and nothing happened here before him in terms of European civilization. But if we're, to believe that the Moors were here, why wouldn't they have castles, especially considering these are sort of Moorish designs? And I mean,
exactly.
There's a lot of architects who went about, reviving this style, but how do we know that that wasn't a revival and rather it was a revision where they were just revising the history and saying, oh no, this, Yale graduate architect designed this, not, the Spanish 200 years ago. And then, a couple generations go by and people don't remember the original story. They just see what's written in history books.
So I think people should be critical of every theory, of every timeline they're being given, even the Tartarian ones. And Tartaria is kind of turning into, this whole Tartarian field realm is kind of turning into a joke, a circle jerk. People are just, stuck in these echo chambers of like mud flood, or you get
Great
the idea.
Fires. I see you. Yeah, we're well aware of it on this show for sure.
But I understand. Tartaria is a little out there, especially being called Tartaria. But what would I look for? Because you're not always gonna get the truth handed up to you on a silver platter. So you have to be able to look at motives. You can fill in the cracks yourself in history if you can understand motive. Who stands to gain what? Who stands to lose what? Right. By these changing of hands throughout history.
Right.
Well, let's talk about Florida. Who came into Florida and established most of what we consider modern Florida? St. Augustine, Palm Beach, Miami, Key West, and all of the railroad in between. Henry Flagler. Henry Flagler is the partner, co-founder of Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller. So you've probably heard of John D. Rockefeller.
Right.
Not many people. I know you have heard of Flagler, but not many people have heard of Henry Flagler. Well, some consider him to be Rockefeller's superior.
Wow.
Because Flagler and his stepbrother were both original founders, and that's 2 against 1, right? And he also had many ties to these other families, big American houses. But Flagler, like I said, built all of the railroad down the east coast of Florida. Well, Henry Plant, so you have Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. Henry Plant built built the railroad on the west coast of Florida, down to the Tampa Bay area. And we were just looking at St. Augustine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's look at Tampa Bay Hotel, Tampa Bay, 1900.
Wow.
Well, that looks pretty Moorish to me.
Well, you got those onion sort of domes, right? Those are considered
minarets.
Kind of Russian.
Minarets. Mm-hmm. They're almost Russian. You're exactly right. They're almost like Greek Orthodox architecture.
Right.
It's kind of a little beyond just Moorish. This is like Islamic influenced Russian architecture, it almost looks like. And that connection is extremely important because Tampa Bay is not just Tampa. Tampa Bay is a bay, and in that bay are multiple cities. There's Tampa. Well, there's also St. Petersburg. Right. St. Petersburg is the little peninsula that juts out into Tampa Bay. And St. Petersburg, as we were saying before, is probably a Tartarian signature of St. Petersburg, Russia, which is in the Baltic Sea. You have the Gulf Stream going from St. Petersburg, Florida, to St. Petersburg, Russia. And you have this type of architecture in both cities. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. There's a strange connection with St. Petersburg and a guy named James Shelby Downard who wrote the King Kill 33 manuscript that became kind of famous in the conspiracy underworld. And also he has a strange connection to the pavers, people who asphalt paved much of the roads throughout the south of the United States, not as far south as Florida. I don't think he was in St. Petersburg for any other reason than he needed to find a place to get away from where he was from. But yeah, he came up in some research we were doing a few months ago on a different show. My friend Michael Wan and I, who does all the Susquehanna alchemy stuff. And yeah, it's interesting that the way we go about researching this stuff, you're digging through all of this history that occurred where you live. And, I think part of the strange thing about going about this research is where it intersects with your own life. That's kind of happening with me and Skull and Bones and researching this stuff in New Haven and how it connects to the broader picture. And I'm sure you have similar accounts with your own life where maybe things synchronistically overlapped, or a book falls off the shelf and all of a sudden you're figuring out something that was right on the the next clue that you needed or what have you. But Dr. Longo, we're at that 2-hour mark. It's been quite a conversation. We've covered a lot. I think Florida was the Garden of Eden. I don't know. I'm sold. And I have watched a couple of your videos, so I encourage everybody to go check that out. Would you tell them where they can go and support you? Do you have a website, or is everything just on YouTube? How can people get in touch with you and show you some support?
I'm most active on YouTube, pretty much only on YouTube and Instagram. So YouTube at Old World Florida, and Instagram old_world_Florida.
Right on.
So Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Mark.
man. No, this has been a pleasure. Like I alluded to many times, we've spoken once before on Illuminati Confirmed, episode 19, and then we had a conversation on your show with Juan. So that was, a lot of nice prep for me to have you on this show. I definitely want to have you on my other podcast, Esoteric America, and maybe focus just on one city, whichever one you choose, whichever one has the most connections or whatever's particularly interesting at that moment. But either way, this has been a great episode. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? I mean, there's a lot of people that listen to this show that want to go out and do their own research, and I'm certain, feel inspired after hearing everything you've talked about. Do you have any tips for any would-be sleuthers, researchers out there?
Yeah, for sure. You can follow the mounds. Pretty much every state in the continental United States, I would say, has a mound. Every state has mounds for sure. Mound complexes, earthworks, rock carvings, something like this. Whether it's an anomaly, whether it's something that makes your state unique, there's always these equivalents across states, whether it's the rune stones, right, in Ohio, Pennsylvania. There's all these little threads that you can pull, and they'll always lead you down somewhere. And I didn't start going through local museums till recently. When I started out, I was just on my laptop. But once I made the Saxer documentary, we started going to museums in these different cities. And you'd be surprised what you can find in there. Pretty much all native history is obscured, There wasn't just one type of Native American that was spread across America. So that in itself is a rabbit hole to be plunged down. But that's really it. Every state does have as much as I want Florida to be special, and I know it is special. Every state has this amount of rabbit holes, old world history for sure.
Yeah, no, we're all blessed that you found yourself to be born in Florida. It's a big state, and someone's got to go through it and cover it. So, yeah, thanks, brother. I appreciate it. And if anybody's listening who lives in Florida, if you've seen one of these anchor stones and it's not in Dr. Longo's videos, maybe give him an email, send him a message, comment, and tell him, because I'm sure you're on the lookout still. I've gotten a lot of cool tips from listeners that way about different sites around here in New England, and I agree, man. There's many things that we can plunge and get out of this deep rabbit hole here in the esoteric America. But I look forward to our future conversations. Until next time, everybody listening, have a great moment wherever you are in the now.
Broadcasting the moon matrix from the lunar surface. They want you confused, like you never knew your purpose. Hopping through the portals, dismantling the machine, questioning everything. I can't believe what I've seen. Memories of a war of the Pleiadians and Anunnaki, stuck within the genes of a copy of a human body. DNA fractal, the universe within me. Epiphanies of science is hoarded by the Illuminati. Puppet masters know the power of the mantra, repeating mad lies till it has an effect on ya. Subliminal messages hijack your perception, tricking the population with holographic projections. We see through it, the system is unraveling. I'm astral traveling through the library of the Vatican on a sacred journey. I embark with the squad, forever meditating on the concept of God. Gotta know the facts, never hold back, cause I ain't getting caught up in the soul trap. I dissect the fabric of reality, looking for the answers, searching through the galaxy. You might be feeling stressed out. Depression, anxiety is no measure of health. To be well adjusted to a sick society, you don't even know how powerful you are. We the ones who gonna expose the whole facade. I awoke in a deep underground military base, zero recollection of how I got to this place. Alien corpses floating in glass cylinders must have been extracted when they crashed into us. Animal hybrids contained in the cages. A lion with the eagle head, monkeys with reptilian faces. Losing my mind and I'm feeling desperate. I look around the room and I see no sign of an exit. All of a sudden the wall flickers away, revealing a hangar full of spacecraft, my getaway. I run to the nearest one, see a guard knock him out, rob him for his plasma gun. Hop in the ship, take the controls, they highly intuitive, I figure it out easily. Lift off, accelerate through a tunnel until I see the light. Fly into the sky, get flanked by 6 F-35s. Gotta know the facts, never hold back, cause I ain't getting caught up in the soul trap. I dissect the fabric of reality, looking for the answers, searching through the galaxy. You might be feeling stressed out. Depression, anxiety is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. You don't even know how powerful you are. We the ones who gonna expose the whole facade.